Hello, I'm Pamela Young from Growth Curve, and I'm here to introduce one of the first of our chief executives who's joining Thrive 2030. Welcome, Scott Pickering. I'd just like to introduce Scott. He is the Chief Executive of the Accident Compensation Corporation in New Zealand, which is a government-funded social insurer that provides injury cover for New Zealanders and visitors to the country. It's also one of our biggest fund managers with assets of around 50 billion. So it's a big responsibility that you have there, Scott. Scott also sits on a number of boards, including Kiwi Bank, which is a New Zealand-owned bank for Kiwis by Kiwis, and the Chubb Insurance Company, which is across Australia and Asia. Previous to joining the ACC in 2013, Scott was the chief executive of a number of insurers across Asia and Europe, with responsibility across Africa as well, and the Australasia. So he's got broad experience across the whole world, having worked for Cigna, Willis, and Royal and Sun Alliance. So Scott brings a lot of global experience and is well positioned to talk with us about how this pandemic might be affecting us now and some of the things that we have to look forward to. So thanks so much for joining us today, Scott. I know you've got a very big agenda, so really appreciate your time.
Hey, Pamela, it's great to be with you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, you're most welcome. Now, I understand that you're not at your head office in Wellington today, but you are in the beautiful Bay of Plenty, Tauranga. Have you been there for the weekend doing a bit of fishing or something?
Well, this is my happy place. Tauranga is where we're lucky enough to have a family home, and I managed to get a little bit of golf in at the weekend. Normally it'd be a bit of fishing as well, but unfortunately bit of a weather bomb occurred on Sunday. So, but it is nice to be here, and I guess one of the benefits of, if I can say that, from COVID is that flexibility that obviously we'll probably have a little bit of a chat about before. So getting a bit of work done today here.
Oh, that's fantastic. You're right about that weather storm. It hit us here as well. So today I'm going to join you in beautiful Tauranga. This is your beautiful harbour, is it not?
It is. It's outstanding. You just about see my house from there.
So I thought it would be really nice to come down and meet you there. And I think a lot of people will know that little mountain in the background there is Mount Maungarewa, and that beach along the coastline, I think, is where they shoot the Bay Patrol, is it not?
That is quite correct. The New Zealand version of Baywatch, shall we say. Or Bondi Rescue for our Australian friends.
From Bondi Rescue, indeed. So from the east coast of New Zealand, thank you so much. Let's get into Thrive 2030. So just a very quick explanation of what that is all about. It's a bit of a follow-on from the chief executives interviews that I did a few years ago when I wrote my book, Stepping Up, because Growth Curve, our responsibility is to help anticipate some of the interruptions to company growth and to identify what those hurdles are, how to overcome them, so that we can support businesses to do transformation. Now, you've done quite a bit of transformation in your own business in recent years, which you're going to help us understand a little bit about that shortly. The reason that I've pulled together some chief executives to have these conversations is this is just another one of those major growth hurdles that worldwide business is facing right now. Previously, we had the GFC. Previous to that, we had the Y2K disaster when everybody thought the computers were going to fall over. And then before that, we had the Wall Street crash. Now, every decade or two, there is something that interrupts global business. Those previous three were driven economically. This one is being driven by a pandemic, is something that we had no experience of. So I'm hoping that these interviews and your insights might help us to understand, how do we navigate going forward in this period of ongoing uncertainty? Before we get to the forward-looking position, would you mind sharing with us how it landed on you as a chief executive of the Accident Compensation Corporation, which is a major institution in New Zealand? How did it affect you as the chief executive of that business?
Yeah, well, I guess you'd start off by saying you can never plan for these sorts of things, and you've articulated that. But I guess as a government agency, we were somewhat lucky in the sense that we were receiving regular updates, I suppose, about the emerging situation with the pandemic. We made the call in about mid-February to actually institute our crisis management team. Now, I won't say we've been lucky, but having had several disasters, and you mentioned in your opening around the fact that we are a unique scheme in the sense that we provide accident cover for every single New Zealander as well as visitors to New Zealand. So we have a responsibility to an entire nation. And so therefore we have had several incidents over the past several years. Now we have had to react to those, namely things like the Whakaari White Island volcanic explosion, the tragedy of the Christchurch mosque attacks, and several other natural disasters. And what that often requires is a crisis management team to be able to respond. So we fundamentally had the bones of that team ready to stand up at a moment's notice. And I think that actually allowed us, probably to be fair, as the country ultimately went into lockdown in March, a 2 or 3 week head start, if you will, to make sure that we were as prepared as we could be. We didn't know what we didn't know at the time, but that was, I suppose, a little bit of a luxury in the sense that we already had the framework in place that we could stand up pretty quickly. And that was extremely helpful, particularly as we moved into lockdown. And of course, it was a hard lockdown, which, as you know, meant that essentially outside of essential services, the country did grind to a halt. Now, that has significant implications on us as an organisation, because just because the lockdown occurred, one of the big challenges was for people who receive funding from us, who receive support from us, they needed that level of certainty that they were still going to be able to get their weekly payments or potentially the services that we were providing to them. And so that was something that we were very, very careful about in terms of our planning. The key things that we needed to look at as we moved into this is, could we still make payments? Could we, and importantly, and this is for any organisation, could we still pay our staff? Those were the sorts of things. How did we get in touch with our vulnerable clients? Really key things that we came together to really make sure that we had in place. As we transitioned into lockdown, into that hard lockdown, we saw the significant benefits of the transformation program that we have actually implemented over the past several years coming to the fore. We have approximately 3,500 staff, and within 4 days of that lockdown, over 95% of our staff, including our contact centres, were able to work remotely. And what that meant was we could stand up our business in a virtual sense and actually respond to our customers' needs. And in many cases, of course, that was just allaying the fears that we would not be there for them. And essentially, we turned that around and said, we are there for you. We can support you just as we've been able to support you. Really, really critical things to do very, very rapidly.
I do recall, yes, I appreciate completely the preparation that the natural disasters and the mosque shooting and your rapid response would have prepared you, because you'd had those in the last couple of years. What were you not prepared at an emotional level? Because those things that you're talking about are because of the transformation, you had your operations ready, you had systems ready, your people were used to getting into action quickly. But at an emotional level, was there a change that you hadn't seen before because of the nature of it?
Yeah, I think, Pamela, the reality is everyone's affected by this. In a natural disaster, it's in a particular geography or it's within a defined space or area, if you will. You know, with something like this, not only were we impacted, our staff were impacted, our customers were impacted, and none of us knew what we didn't know. I mean, with something such as a pandemic, of course, and we're already seeing this, there is no such thing as a finish line. It's not like, well, all we need to do for the next X months is this, and therefore it'll be done. And I think for me, grappling with the uncertainty, the materiality, how big is this going to be? I mean, early on, you know, there were, information provided by the government, etc., that this could have, tens of thousands of deaths, and the strain on our systems. We just weren't prepared for it. So managing that uncertainty while still creating a level of, I suppose, certainty and comfort for staff. I think it's certainly at a leadership level really, really important at this time. So grappling with that uncertainty, biggest thing that you have to deal with, I think.
Yes. What about your suppliers, your outside providers?
Yeah.
How did it impact them, and what was that impact? How did that impact you?
Well, that for me was probably one of the big things for us. I mean, we rely on an incredible network of providers, right from our core health system, so our district health boards that provide normal, obviously, illness as well as accident care,
Yeah.
through to specialist providers, surgeons, physiotherapists, other support workers for people who can come and provide community support and care to people in their homes if they're of a serious injury or they have an injury that requires additional support. Now that was this was a major disruption. I mean, for example, individuals did not have the ability to be able to visit with their GP if
or their physio.
normal illness or even, obviously in our case, an accident. So a lot of the normal mechanisms with which you would engage with providers all of a sudden were taken away. And that was an incredible disruption. Now, what we were able to do was work very, very rapidly with the sector to be able to provide a different form of support. And this is really where telehealth was born, if you will. So instead of having a face-to-face consultation, they were doing, our customers and our providers were essentially having what you and I are having today, which is, of course, a new form of consultation. Now, of course, for some, for example, and I'll just use one, acupuncture, it's impossible to be able to do that by video, but much of the actual engagement could start to change and could take place via things like telehealth. So, in a sense, that's a huge disruption. There was a reasonably rapid solution to a major problem. And what's really interesting, of course, is that then has become part of the new way of working. And yet something that would not have been considered 14 or 15 months ago. It just wouldn't have been the way that we did things. So that was, for me, a demonstration of responsiveness under pressure, but a pragmatic response to at least try and support customers in an effective way.
So a lot of the health providers have set up online appointments, bookings, and those providers are now giving those services via Zoom and so forth.
That's right. And that's right. And it's a combination now, Pamela. So you've got, obviously, I mean, I don't think one would ever want to lose the face-to-face, but for example, if it's just to check in on, say, some medical results, for example, rather than having an individual, and let's take an elderly person, perhaps have to take public transport and then wait in a doctor's waiting room for a period of time, and then take that public transport back. They can actually engage via, this type of video, and I think that's actually, it's a positive, I think, in terms of care that can be provided.
I think it's definitely a positive in terms of improving the quality of the services, to put pressure on all businesses to invest in their technology and their delivery of services that way. It would have caused quite a bit of pain for some businesses that didn't have the skill or the budget, but in time, I think people are catching up in that regard. Scott, with your 95% of your people working from home, most businesses are now got this challenge. How do we manage people? How do we shape the culture? How do we mentor and lead people when they're not physically in the office? And in New Zealand, unlike many countries that may be watching this, there are still, countries and regions that are in lockdown. People are still working from home. And of course, the big question is, how do you lead when you can't get them on the stage in a big auditorium? Have you had a sense of how you might change your leadership and your mentoring and your, performance evaluations and those sorts of things if people are not physically there?
Well, I think it's a great question, and you're quite right. We've kind of gone through the spectrum of being in full lockdown, partial lockdown, back to regional lockdowns, to no lockdowns. And
Yes.
and the reality is that cycle may not be as rapid as it was, but it is likely to become the new norm. So you have this really interesting dynamic of how do you cope with the new ways of working. And I think, you know, globally, that is the big question that organizations are looking at. How do we create this flexibility without losing productivity, without losing performance, and without losing that engagement? So if I look at it at spectrum, I think one of the things which is absolutely critical for business leaders and was that you can't communicate enough, right? And
Yeah.
particularly in the early stages, the
Yeah.
ability and the platforms that we had were basically of this nature.
Yeah.
So, you know, every week I was out there in front of those 3,500 staff in video messaging, making sure that it always wasn't too serious as well. And I think
Yeah.
adding a
Yeah.
little bit of humor and levity to a pretty challenging situation, whilst
Yes.
not underestimating that, was actually really important, and people really responded to that.
Mhm.
Um, but coming back to, you know, the grappling with how do organisations evolve in terms of their ways of working, we've come up with a solution in the sense that we have, and I should also mention, whilst I had 95% of staff working remotely in the hard lockdown, there was a real desire from our staff to return to the office
Mm.
post lockdown. So that was a very, well, in the majority of staff, to return to the office post lockdown.
Yeah.
What we've adapted ourselves to is a form of flexible working. Now, there are some parts of our organisation that can't necessarily work remotely or not effectively work remotely, but the majority can undertake their tasks to do so. So what we've now implemented is essentially 2 days a week of flexible working, 2 days a week though, which are critical, where you teams have to be together, right? So we're not saying, so it's not just Monday and Friday happy days.
Yeah.
It's actually about spreading it across the organization, but making sure that teams come together physically for 2 days a week, 2 days a
Right.
week with flexibility. And then there's sort of if you like, a floating day, which could actually end up being in the office or potentially remotely.
Sure.
And
I mean, that's a logistical
yeah,
response, and I
yeah,
get that completely. It's really good to put it out there what your
yeah,
requirements are to get them together.
yeah,
But going beyond the logistical response,
yeah.
have you and your leaders, people managers, had some ideas about how you may build that sense of belonging, that sense of culture, that sense of we're still uh,
Yeah,
understanding and eating, because we are social beasts, or we'd all be living in the hills alone in a cabin. We like to be together,
yeah,
and I know there's a resistance to coming back to the office in a lot of places.
yes,
Some of the banks are having a big challenge
yeah,
with getting people
yeah,
back, but we
yeah,
have to think about what is it that's going to bond that team rather
yeah.
than just the logistics. Is there a mechanism or a scheme that you've got underway?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things. One is that, as I said, we have that if you like, that compulsory nature for people to
Yes.
actually be together. So it's not like an optionality, and we're deliberately
Yes.
done that. We've also undertaken quite a significant change to the design of our office space, particularly in our corporate sites, to
Okay.
allow much greater use of collaborative areas. So we've broken down those sort of traditional offices, you know, open plan. We've
Yeah.
gone to a far more collaborative hot desk type environment, but actually created environments where staff actually feel it's more comfortable, and actually they want to be together collaborating. We're also very lucky in the sense that as we've gone through our organizational transformation, we've actually adapted much more towards the agile ways of working, which
Okay.
actually calls for much greater levels of collaboration across the business. So
Yeah.
it's one of those things that you've got to kind of create parameters. And I think that the one thing that came out very strongly for us last year, particularly with COVID, was the sense of purpose of our organisation. That
Yeah.
really came to the surface. Much levels of engagement for our staff, because they knew that they were doing a job for a country, and that was really, really important for them, that they were
Okay.
there when
Yeah.
they were really needed, And we've seen that not only in our staff engagement, but we've also seen it in record levels of public trust and confidence for the organisation.
So what you're saying is that the COVID focused you in on your purpose
Yes.
more than any other because of the crisis.
Correct. And so the challenge now is holding on to that and
Yes.
building on it. So it's actually about turning things around, and instead of saying what didn't work, you actually turn it around and say, so what worked? How do we actually harvest that and make sure that that actually is embedded in the way that we do things, and don't lose the opportunity that COVID gave us. And so what did COVID give us? It gave us a level of purpose, a sense of actually delivering for a country, a sense of pride in doing what we're doing, but also the fact that we didn't have to do things just the way that we'd always done them. So it was a sense of, actually, I really want to be part of this organisation, came through loud and clear.
Yeah.
I now have the tools, because of the investment that we've actually made in the business, to be able to do my job, not only at work, but at home. And in fact, I could never have that opportunity before. And I'm being given an opportunity to actually be flexible in the way that I go about things, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, definitely. I can see the just your note about that sense of purpose becoming more important, because the whole country was watching the health sector. We're all sitting at home in lockdown. The daily news was Jacinda Ardern with the Minister of Health and the Secretary of Health. And so the focus was in on how the health sector is going to get us out of this problem.
Yeah.
And your people, being part of the health sector as personal injury cover, insurers, are very fundamental to that. You made this statement just earlier. Your people now understand how important it is that they're working for a country in a government department that provides health insurance and support and disability to people with injury. I think that's a really important illustration of the intersection between business and society. So can we just work on that or explore that a little bit more? Because I think it's a really important part of who you are.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think what was really fascinating was, and we as an organisation, ACC straddles both, if you like, the public and private sector, because we operate off in many ways with a board. We operate with businesses in New Zealand, and obviously we operate with New Zealanders. You mentioned in your opening, where on one side, we're New Zealand's largest insurance company in the sense of the accident insurance that we provide, but on the other side, we're one of New Zealand's largest sovereign wealth funds. So we've kind of got this whole public-private dimension to us. But ultimately, and what we're grounded in, is that social contract with New Zealand. The fact that as a country, we gave up the right to sue for personal injury to ensure that we actually had a social insurance scheme that was there for us. The interesting thing for me is you've got this, when these challenges and crises happen, people do look to the public sector to be able to provide that level of support. And I have to say, I marvel at the way that the actual public sector does stand up across many departments and comes together and actually does really provide that level of certainty and support for the public and for the private sector as well. I think that's a really interesting dynamic. The reality is, you really see it come to the fore during crisis. I mean, that's just the reality. I think that's where.
Just on that, taking the social business social intersection a step further. One of the things that does happen with every one of these major global adjustments, like the GFC, the Wall Street crash, and now the pandemic, is because they are so major, they shift our belief system. Because what happened before is different from what's going to happen going forward, because the shift is so fundamental. And underneath those belief systems are the values, and underneath those are the assumptions that we have held dear for many years. Now, the assumption was that the last pandemic was in 1919, so over 100 years ago. Now that assumption is gone. The assumption that we will never have one of those, because we're so sophisticated, we've got such terrific medical and biological advancements that this is never going to happen to us. It has happened. So that assumption is gone, What do you think are the new assumptions going forward, and how are they going to change both A, your business culture, and B, the culture of New Zealand? What's going to be the shift in our belief system as a result of this catastrophic, brick wall that arrived and said, sorry, you were wrong about that. It's now a different world.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting dynamic that I see down in New Zealand, because on one side, the overarching comment I would make is I think that this has demonstrated our vulnerability to the outside, potentially at times for risks that are beyond our control. So I think that that's one thing that I think is certainly, it's not like we can sit back and say, oh yes, that's happening on the other side of the world. That's really interesting. I'll watch it on the nightly news or whatever the case may be, but it's not going to happen here. So
Yes.
I think that has created an anxiety. It's created an uncertainty. That, if you will, is on the challenging side and challenging our ways of looking at things. One of the benefits is actually, conversely, our geographic isolation, particularly for this pandemic, because it allowed the government in particular to be able to manage our borders and to manage sort of as best we could the flow of disease. But I think what it's probably done is realize that, look, we're not immune to anything. It can happen anywhere, anytime. I think the things that we've talked about today are natural disasters. And as you say, I mean, the last significant pandemic was over 100 years ago or thereabouts. But, what's next? What's the next thing? And I think that's something that I think all businesses are very focused on. I know certainly with a number of the businesses that I'm involved with in the private sector, and indeed, I could talk about it from an ACC perspective, the spectre of cybercrime, etc., is a risk for businesses, which was never on their radars previously. Well, certainly not to the magnitude it is today. But again, it has demonstrated that cybercrime, etc., it doesn't necessarily know any borders. It doesn't know any jurisdiction, and it doesn't. That counts for nothing.
I think you're right there, Scott. The Y2K didn't happen, but a few years later, the Twin Towers did happen. So sometimes we have these expectations of catastrophes and we go, oh, ho hum, aren't we clever? We got through that. After 9/11, the culture and the assumptions and the beliefs and values of all Americans changed forever, because that security they thought they always had from the rest of the world was gone. I think our moment was the mosque in shootings in Christchurch. All of a sudden, that was our first experience of, as you said, we're vulnerable, we're not safe. These things can happen to us. The pandemic is the same, as you've just described. It's one of those things that we never had it was not on our radar at all. For the last 10 years, most chief executives, the thing that's been hounding them has been digital transformation, and billions of dollars going into, upgrading their services to improve productivity, to get AI and Internet of Things and machine learning, and to use all these skills and knowledge to boost productivity, to stay ahead of the curve, and to make sure they remain relevant. That agenda may still be important. However, I think the more important agenda going forward is the one you've just raised, which is, what on earth can we expect next? Now, if you look at the journey, these major global interruptions happen about every decade. 87, 2000, 2008, 2020. Thrive 2030, the title of that is to help us recognize that it may be another 10 years before we have another major global disruption, but perhaps not. Perhaps there's another pandemic around the corner. Perhaps there's something else we haven't thought of. So how do we as chief executives and organizations deal with that? The visibility is not there. So writing strategy in a world of uncertainty, it's so much more difficult.
It is. I think there's two things that I'd say, which I think are really critical. You touched upon, businesses focusing on if you like, the technology arms race in order to make their businesses fit for purpose. You can't afford to ignore a focus on investing in technology. I think that's really critical, because your consumers, your customers, there is an expectation of a much more instantaneous form of service. And I think organizations that are stuck with legacy platforms, legacy technology, it's just increasing the risk. So I think that the ability for organizations to continue to invest in that space is important. I think there are options and opportunities to do so. That's one side of the fence. But the other thing that I see as being absolutely critical for organizations to invest in, particularly as we head to whatever the next thing is actually around mental well-being. And my big concern around COVID is, and it's not over, as we know globally. We've still got, but we can see some green shoots. Vaccination programs in other countries seem to be doing better, stemming the tide of new cases. All of those things are important, and there are I think, some real hope coming out around. Well, we're addressing this, and ultimately, it will become another illness. But what we're not necessarily addressing, I think, is the potential growth in mental well-being, changes to mental health. Make no mistake, this pandemic has had a significant impact on people's lives, personally and in the workplace. And I don't think that has necessarily manifested itself as much as what we are going to see over the next several years. And if organizations are not prepared to lean into this, to face into it, and actually to invest in the well-being of their staff, and that's not fruit on a Friday morning, or dress casual days, or whatever the case may be. This is a real look at what tools that they can actually invest in to support their people, to allow them to be all they can be in this new environment that we talk about. And it's a significant investment, I believe, that is required, both not only from a financial point of view, but more importantly, from an understanding and a time and resources point of view, to be able to support staff. For me, that's the next big thing.
On that note, when you're sitting with your top team at your weekly meetings, do you have an agenda for innovations that you are working on to address some of your mental well-being issues that you are projecting forward?
I think we don't know what we don't know, but I think that is fast becoming much more of a priority for us as a team on how we address it and what tools we need to do. And it's not once and done, oh, we've done that and that's fine. It's actually understanding what the issue is, how does it manifest itself, and then look at how we can look to address it. Because it's not just about a counselling session here and there. Of course, we need to make those sorts of things available for our people, because sometimes people are just feeling a short-term level anxiety, but actually understanding what some of the long-term impacts are and how we can address them is really important to us. And it's not, again, about just here's a new app, just go and use it and everything will be right. There are tools, don't get me wrong, and I think there's some really good tools, but how do you stitch all of that together and actually say, this is our commitment to our people in this space? Yes. And I'll be really honest with you, Pamela, we're not there yet. We're not there, but we have those conversations, and I think that's really, really important. So as much as I think it's critical for organizations to be focused on, here's the environment, this is where we see it going, and this is either the products or the services that we'll need to be able to deliver to support that changing environment, critical to business's strategy. Don't lose sight of that most valuable commodity that you have, and that's your people. And how do you look after them most effectively in this new environment? And so I personally think that needs, and it's not just in the hands of HR or your talent division or whatever. It is an issue that I know resonates not only around management teams, but also clearly it is a major issue at board tables nowadays.
Good to hear. Because I think those of us who are parents of teenagers, we have been facing this challenge, and school teachers are facing the challenge of children having so much screen time, and the impact of that on their physical, desire to go out and play sports and their social interaction with other people. So as adults in the workplace who are now being forced to have more screen time and work from home and do our meetings remotely and so forth, I think what you're describing as the mental health challenge, it's now becoming a bigger issue, a much broader social issue. It's not just about the younger generation. So on that note, can I just ask you what you might be asking of boards? Because there's going to be, as you say, it's something that needs to be on the chief executive and the top team agenda. It's not something you can delegate to HR. It needs to be a way of doing business. What would you suggest boards might look to do differently to support chief executives and their top teams through these really challenging times?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge thing, because I think boards need to challenge themselves around the time that they actually spend on this particular subject. Empathy for me and EQ at a board level is a lever that perhaps has not always been pulled as much as it could or should be.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think that many boards and management teams have become closer over this period of time. And that has been through a matter of need, much more regular interactions around what was happening in the business, what we're seeing, many more ad hoc conversations rather than fixed board meetings. All of those things I think are important, because what it hopefully demonstrates is that boards are there for management and vice versa.
Yeah.
But as we emerge and as we start to evolve and as we come out of what we've seen through the pandemic, what are boards doing to actually make sure that the well-being of the organisation is kept as a core topic of discussion, support, commitment? And I certainly know from some of the boards that I'm involved with, that has definitely starting to emerge, but with the acknowledgement that, as you said earlier, we are in the early days, if you will, of this becoming, much more of our norm rather than something that was perhaps talked about in quiet out to the corner. And I think organisations that, and boards in particular, that embrace well-being as a core competency, as much as they look at ROI, quarterly results, and all of those sorts of things, will be the organisations that ultimately win.
Yes, I think it's been something that's been on the radar for a decade or so, and it's been a challenge to get people to focus in on the culture and what they call the soft stuff. But in my experience, because I do a lot of culture work, it's not the soft stuff, it's the tough stuff, because it's the thing that you can't see. And therefore, you have to have a deeper understanding of how do you evaluate signs and signals that give you a suggestion that your culture is either working for you or against you. So as you go forward, let's just talk about how do we navigate forward in this times of uncertainty. I guess it's a bit like a pioneer who's trying to build a plan to cross the Arctic, not knowing, having only the sundial to direct them because there's no roads and the place is going to be covered in snow shortly, so there'll be no trees or other landmarks to give you a guidance. We're kind of in that space, aren't we, where the usual landmarks, the usual markings that we have as chief executives who are formulating strategy, we've usually got these things that guide us. For example, economic indicators or market challenges or technology opportunities. These things give us a sense of how do we compete. Now, in a public sector environment, it's slightly different, but you've still got goals to achieve. You've still got ambitions to support people with particular types of injuries to get them back to work on time in a shorter time frame, and to make sure that people that may have borderline permanent disability, that you do everything to overcome the permanent disability and get them back to work. So just on that sort of going forward, how do we, as pioneers, on the ice without these markers, what are we going to draw on to make decisions about how to move forward?
I think one thing that I'd say right up front, Pamela, and that is that what chief executives and executive leaders in organisations need to do is actually dial in with what their people are thinking. And in particular for me, what I take time to do is understand what it means to somebody new joining the organisation, or even as we look at intern programs or graduates, what's actually floating their boat. And
Yes.
it's quite different than perhaps what you would perceive. And so that,
Yes.
for me, a big learning over the last couple of years is actually getting that connectivity about what drives our next generation of talent, what's important for them in an employer. Because if you're not creating the environment that actually supports their principles and purpose, then you're going to be challenged. Now, it doesn't mean to say that we're all just racing around on skateboards, etc. But the reality is that we need to understand why people want to join the organization. What does it mean and what does it stand for? And therefore, how do we create that? And I definitely see from a generational point of view that there is a far greater focus on the purpose of an organization and what it does than necessarily what it's necessarily always delivered fiscally. And that's quite a change for businesses, because I don't think they're mutually exclusive, by the way. I think
No.
they can coexist quite nicely.
Yes.
But if you don't know, how can you actually then deliver?
What about New Zealand? Let's just turn our focus to the big picture for a minute.
Yeah.
There has been, crossing my mind over the last 12 months, there have been quite a number of conversations of certain groups of chief executives getting together to help the government identify what the strategy should be to stimulate growth and get us back on track. Not so much dealing with the pandemic, but more about supporting businesses, the exporters and the SMEs and so forth. I don't see a lot that has come out of business. I can't hear the big plan hitting the table. You're closer to the government and business leadership sector. Can you just enlighten us what is happening? And do we have a sense of the government? I know we're still dealing with the pandemic and we've still got the challenge with borders. That's very much a very big focus for the airlines and airports and travel and tourism. I understand from chief executives in shipping that it's going to be 2 years for the backlog to be cleared. So from a small business point of view, as a chief executive who is in the government sector, but aligned to the insurance sector, which is very private, what's the talk? How are we going to direct businesses to move forward?
Yeah, it's a really tough one, and obviously I walk an interesting fine line in my role.
Yes.
And so I won't and can't necessarily comment on government policy, but suffice to say, I think that the way that you've spoken about the fact that it is quite clear from the government's perspective that they do need to get their arms around the pandemic and actually, make sure that we're protected as well as we can be. And I think we can all acknowledge and accept that that is a critical priority.
Absolutely.
But I think they've done a great job. But there is this friction, if you will, because we've got we know that there is a desire to sort of keep moving forward, and we're seeing that. We're seeing some booms in areas such as construction and housing and things of that nature. We know there's a need for infrastructure to support our economy going forward, and many of these plans and programs are multi-year programs of work. But we do see this sort of almost, we're nearly there. We can sort of see what the future could look like, but now we've got this gap in terms of being able to deliver it. And I think that's where those private sector chief executives, and New Zealand has an incredibly talented chief executives in our country, people who are here because they want to be here, want to contribute, want to make a difference.
Yes.
And the neat is that with 5 million people, we can do all of that. But the reality is we also need the rest of the world to be ultimately successful. And I can just see this tension at the moment that's occurring, whereby we kind of know what we want, but we're not just quite sure how we can get there. And I think that's something that that's why having those chief executives involved with the government, I think, is a good thing, because hopefully that voice is coming through. We may not have seen it all yet, but those messages are definitely, I think, getting through. And I know that, I'm positive that once the government does get its arms around the COVID situation to the best degree possible, the next phase is definitely about opening us up to be able to achieve more.
Speaking about next phases, Scott, we'll share with our listeners that you have resigned from the chief executive position of the Accident Compensation Corporation after 8 years. You're very entitled to move on to a new career. What next for Scott? What have you got on your mind? Back to Asia?
Yeah, look, I mean, I guess my business DNA is very much in the Asia Pacific region in particular, but also,
Yes.
as you mentioned early on, in Africa and Eastern Europe in particular. I've been very, very lucky to
Yeah.
live in 8 different countries around the world, do business in over 50 of them. And so, but, I'm a proud Kiwi, and I probably am being very open-minded at this point, very deliberately so. I've loved my 8 years as Chief Executive of ACC. What we've been able to achieve in that time has been fantastic, and it's been an incredible privilege. But for me, I could probably go down a couple of routes, and I'm being very deliberate and not thinking about those until the 1st of July, which is sort of...
1 month to go.
Yeah, um, I think the opportunity to potentially work again within Asia is something that does attract me. It's in my business DNA.
Yes.
At the same time, I'm potentially looking at developing on my governance responsibilities, something that I'm enjoying doing, looking at business through a different lens, and that's an interesting one in and of itself.
Yeah.
But one thing I think I'm really committed to doing as well is always continuing to work with people, whether that's leadership groups, whether it's organizations that are looking at transformation. Given the experiences that I've had, particularly in this more recent times, I think that's something that will be really cool. So I'm sort of taking a little bit of my own medicine and perhaps not being as structured as I would normally be, but being a bit more open-minded about those opportunities as and when they will come up. And I'm confident that they will.
Well, you have a very broad career, global career, and one of the benefits of bringing that back to New Zealand is that you get to share that. So I think New Zealand would be very sad to see you leave. However, having been back home for 8 years, there's a lot that you would have learned from that experience as well in government, and whatever you do next is going to be really interesting. We'll be watching. So the last question for you today, given that you may end up in a global situation, is if you happen to be chief executive of the world for a moment, what would you be doing? What would be the priority for you as chief executive of the world? What would be top of mind for you to
Look, the
first
big
100 days?
I would be championing greater human interaction. And I think that we've touched upon it in our conversation today, our focus on devices and the like. If I could do anything for a moment, would be to put those devices down and have a conversation. I think that's something that, if we, that sense of community, that sense of belonging that COVID has actually brought out, I'd just love to see that sort of almost just take it to the next level and actually have people engaging further. I just believe that when people do interact and engage, what happens is ideas, differences of opinions, sure, they surface, but often solutions come out and then great things happen. So as simple as that may sound, you mentioned it, we crave human company. I just want to see that we don't just lose that to devices. And so that would be my simple thing, as simple as it sounds, but just, personal interaction, I'd be very focused on that as a priority.
Sounds like a good priority to me, Scott. Good luck with that next new job. And thank you so much for sharing your time with us today and those wonderful insights. And I wish you all the best in your new career. Scott Pickering, Chief Executive of the Accident Compensation Corporation, New Zealand. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks.